Over the river and through the woods to grandmother's house we go. Now, isn't that a beautiful image? Conjures up images of visiting a gingerbread house for the holidays, for Thanksgiving and Christmas. Wonderful smells, great food, grandmotherly love, right? We all know what that's like. We've all had that experience, right? Am I right?
Yeah.
Well, I never did. My grandmothers were both Jewish and didn't celebrate Christmas. One lived 3,000 miles away, and I never once set foot in her house. The other lived with us and never cooked. So I never had that experience, which was why when I went to New Zealand, I got involved in something that involved the search for Grandma's house. Let me tell you about it. Randy walked into the rundown house, looked around, thanked the residents, and came out. He walked up to Brent and me. It just won't do. We can't shoot here. Why not? Said Brent. It's too seedy. It's just not the right kind of place. Now, we had a problem because Gerald and the lighting crew had already arrived and they were waiting to set up. And the Foots, I keep wanting to call them the Feet, Mr. and Mrs. Foot, were due to arrive in about an hour. And we had no place to shoot. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Foot were the subjects of part of our filming. We were in New Zealand to do a project for New Zealand Telecom, the phone company, to advertise their new 0800 emergency rescue number that they just set up. And it was being used as a portal for the auto club to find stranded motorists on the roads of New Zealand. They were plucking people whose cars had broken down off the roads, and it was a worthwhile project. Now, the people from Telecom had cast this kindly old couple, Mr. and Mrs. Foot. At least we thought they were a kindly old couple. We'd never met them. We'd seen pictures, apple cheeks, big smiles, white hair. They looked like grandparents, or at least what we used to think grandparents looked like. My mother was a grandmother at 43, and she didn't look anything like these people. But nobody had talked to the Foots. The people from Telecom had picked their pictures. And the Foots, I keep wanting to call them the Feet. I'll get over that. The Foots lived 4 or 5 hours outside of Wellington, which was our home base in New Zealand while we were filming there. And rather than spend a whole day getting there and back, Brent, who was our local producer, our fixer, Brent had suggested, why don't we rent a house that's closer to Wellington and have the Foots come there, and we'll film them there, and that way they'll do all the driving and we'll save a lot of time. Randy, our director, said, well, that could work. That definitely could work, as long as we don't mind living a lie. Well, we didn't mind living a lie. We did it all the time. We often filmed on rented or borrowed locations, and we were accustomed to doing it. So Brent had dispatched an assistant to this little town about an hour or two outside of Wellington, and she had come up with this house. And now we were there with the full crew ready to shoot, and Randy rejected the house. Brent turned to him, Randy, tell me again what it is you want. He said, that place was just too seedy. He said, I want something that feels like homey and warm and like Grandma's house. Brent said, I understand. He said, yeah, that place looked like something out of Tobacco Road. So Brent said, I'm sure we can find something, Randy. Get in the car, we'll drive around. You can't just drive around and pick a house at random and walk in and start filming. We have no permits, we have no permission, we have no access. Brent said, get in the car, we'll drive around. And then he looked at me. I was the camera guy, and he said, you too, bud. So we got in the car and we drove around, and most of the neighborhood was much nicer than the rundown house. And after a lot of prodding from Brent, Randy finally chose a real classy looking red brick ranch house with a huge palm tree out front. And Brent knocked on the door, and this grandmotherly looking woman came to the door. It turned out her name was Mrs. O'Brien. And Brent poured on the charm, and he explained. He said, my clients are here from San Francisco. We're doing a film for New Zealand Telecom. It's all about rescuing people on the roads, and we need a place to film. And Mrs. O'Brien, with a huge smile on her face, said she would be delighted to help us out, especially when she heard that Americans were involved and that we only needed her living room for 3 or 4 hours. So she showed us around, and we started to set up. Of course, we offered to pay her but she didn't want any of that. And as we were setting up, She ran into the kitchen and started to bake cookies. Chocolate chip cookies. So Randy and I were flabbergasted by this level of cooperation from a complete stranger and the friendliness that the people of New Zealand had shown us. Brent was not surprised. In fact, we had experienced some of the helpfulness the day before. We'd taken our camera and tripod to the central train station in Wellington. We wanted to get shots of commuters walking down the platform, faces, crowds, trains, stuff like that. And we set up our camera and tripod. We had no permit. We hadn't asked permission. In the film business, there's an old saying, it's better to ask forgiveness than permission. But when you're bringing a big crew to work on something, it's better to have permission before you get there or you might get the boot. So we set up our camera and tripod, and we got some, we were just a minute or two too late. The train that we were focusing on had already arrived by the time we were ready to shoot. We were trying to figure out what to do next. At that moment, a tall, mustachioed man came striding up to us like a poor man's John Cleese in a station master's uniform. "Here now, what's this?" And we were a little startled, and then Brent turned to him and he poured on the charm again. He said, "Oh, good morning, sir. I'm so happy to see you. These are my clients from San Francisco." He repeated the same story. He said, "We're trying to get some shots of the trains arriving, but we seem to have just missed the last train. Tell me, sir, if you don't mind," and the station master interrupted him and he said, "Really now?" And he started to look us up and down very carefully, and I just prayed that I hadn't worn the jeans with the holes in them. But he was glaring at us, and Brent said, "Could you tell us, please, sir, on what track will the 903 arrive?" "Well," said the mustache, thinking very carefully, "just what track would you like it to arrive on?" Again, we were dumbstruck, but I piped up finally. I said, "Track 12, please, sir, because then we can shoot it right from where we are. I can get a shot of the commuters on the platform, the train pulling in, the beautiful skyline of Wellington right behind it. How about track 12? And he said, "All right, done." Accommodating folk, these Kiwis. Now, part of our assignment was to film a woman named Faye, who was an employee of Telecom. And Faye's job was to explain on camera just how the new 0800 emergency rescue number worked. And she did a good job with that. But when we met her the day before we started filming, just in chatting with her, we discovered that Faye, in her spare time, was an Olympic archer. She had been on the New Zealand Olympic archery team representing her country the year before. And Randy thought it would be cool to get some shots of her shooting arrows. So we arranged for her to bring her bow, very scientific bow with lots of sights on it, a bunch of arrows, and her practice target, which was a big, heavy, bulky, compressed straw affair called a butt. Now, because there weren't any obvious locations for archery in downtown Wellington, we opted to schlep Faye's big butt up 2 flights of stairs to the office where we were filming. And I set up the camera right next to the bullseye looking back toward Faye. And I put my head in next to the viewfinder very carefully. I said, "Don't shoot while I'm in here." She said, "I have deadly aim."
Deadly.
That concerned me. She said, "I can hit that bullseye without hitting you." I said, "I don't want to know." And I rolled the camera and ducked out of the way. And very quickly, Faye went and shot 3 arrows into the target. Perfectly centered in the bullseye. And Randy, always being a wise guy, said, "Ever try the Robin Hood thing, splitting arrows?" She said, "Actually, splitting arrows is not very difficult with new scientific bows and arrows." She said, "However, it is very costly because once you split an arrow, it's destroyed and you need to buy new arrows." Now, besides shooting around Wellington, we also got out into the countryside some of the time. New Zealand is an island nation. It's about half pasture land, and there are many, many sheep there. We got close-ups of sheep, we got long shots of sheep, we got shots of sheep posing against the beautiful snow-capped mountains, wide shots of sheep. At the time we were there, New Zealand had 4 million people and 40 million sheep. Now, we really enjoyed being in Wellington. Our crew was friendly and very nice. And Wellington reminded us a lot of San Francisco, a windy, hilly city on a beautiful bay. In this case, the Cook Strait, which is the bay between the North and South Islands of New Zealand. Wellington is the capital, and it's at the very southern end of the North Island. But when our Kiwi friends and crew people opened their mouths, it was pretty obvious we were no longer in California. Now, Brent took us the first night to a brand new restaurant that had just opened that he was excited to take us to. And I read the name of the restaurant and it said SHED numeral 5. Now, how would you say SHED? How would you pronounce that? Right, not in New Zealand. In New Zealand, it's Sheed. And the woman on our crew named Beth was Beef. And if you have $9 and someone gives you 10 more, someone gives you one more, you have $10. Crazy stuff. The second night we were there, we were shooting a sunset, and just as the blood red sun was approaching tangency with a deep blue sea, Brent commented that it's a bit chocolate boxy, isn't it? I said, what does that mean? He said, it's something that's so beautiful, so perfectly beautiful that it's practically cliche, like something you would see on a box of chocolates, which was, outside my experience, all I'd ever seen on a box of chocolates was Hershey's. And then there was a time that we were shooting and Brent said to me, he said, meet me down on the street in a minute. I want to show you another possible location. I said, I'll be right there just as soon as I grab my fanny pack. And all the Kiwis started to chuckle and guffaw, and some of them just laughed out loud. They couldn't contain themselves. And I said to Brent, what did I say? Now, Brent was a pretty serious guy, but he couldn't suppress a giggle. He says, you have to understand, Bill, that here in NZ, New Zealand, here in NZ, fanny refers to women's genitalia, not a derriere, or a butt, for that matter. And all this time you have to understand, I was traveling with a director named Randy. And Randy throughout the Commonwealth has one meaning. I had to call him Randall or Mr. Field, or sometimes I just called him Dr. Horny. People seem to appreciate that. Yeah. Now back at Mrs. O'Brien's, we really were living a lie. Gerald and the lighting crew put some softening material in the window and some warming gel and put a couple of lights outside and created this beautiful artificial sunlight. And the artificial sunlight, when it hit Mr. and Mrs. Foote, looked beautiful, looked like gorgeous, warm morning light. I called out to Gerald and I said, Gerald, I love how the lighting looks. He was out back with the lighting crew. I love how the lighting looks. I'm in love. He said, oh, getting a bit of a stiffy, are you? Well, I wasn't. But we sat the Footes down in two chairs in front of Mrs. O'Brien's teapots and Mrs. O'Brien's knickknacks and pictures of Mrs. O'Brien's children and grandchildren. And we set them up for the interview. Really living a lie. At a certain point, the lights started to shake, and I called out, Gerald, the lights are shaking, steady up. And he was out back, and he called back, rightio. And a few minutes later, the lights started to shake again. And I said, Gerald, steady on, lads, the lights are still shaking. And there was a long pause, and then he called back, we're having some difficulty with the wind and the rain. And I was puzzled because it had been, I thought it was a really beautiful day out. So I went out back because I couldn't see through the window. We had all our paraphernalia in the window. And I went out back and I was greeted by a remarkable scene. It was springtime south of the equator, and the sun was high in a brilliant blue October sky. But at the same time, rain from a storm several miles away was blowing past the windows horizontally on a stiff wind, hitting our lights, hitting the window, sizzling as it hit the hot lights. Sunny, windy, and rainy all at the same time. So eventually, we got to sit down and do the interview, and it proved difficult for Randy. Now, Randy was a very experienced interviewer, but nobody had pre-interviewed these people. The people from Telecom had selected them based on their photographs, but nobody had actually spoken to them. And it turned out that their interview, though pleasant, was extremely unenthusiastic. And they tended to speak very quietly and very, very slowly. And they also spoke in monosyllables, so some of their answers were yes and no. And Randy's a very experienced interviewer, and he knew better than to ask yes or no questions, so he would say, well, how did you feel when you were stranded on the road? Disturbed. But eventually we got through the interview, and it looked fine, and he worked them long enough that we got enough material from them to give us a successful interview. And as we were loading out, there was suddenly a knock on the door. It turned out to be the police. The constable was banging on the door, saying, Mrs. O, your neighbors are telling us that there's some lads here loading stuff into a truck. I want to make sure you're not being robbed. And Mrs. O'Brien opened the door and introduced the constable to her new best friends from San Francisco. She'd known us about an hour at that point. She assured him that everything was fine, and she gave him the rest of the cookies. And as we started to load out, she went into the kitchen and started to bake more chocolate chip cookies. And I said despite the fact that we'd had a difficult time at the beginning of the day because we had no place to shoot, it had worked out pretty well. And I said to Brent, I said, Brent, thank you for all that. Thank you for pushing us to find a new location. That really went very, very well. And he said, oh, it really was a bunch of fluffy ducks, wasn't it? Now, I recognize those as English words, but I'd never heard them in that combination. And I was sure it was some kind of code or some kind of nefarious foreign language that only spies would understand. And I said, what does that mean? He said, it means that things went as well as they possibly could, because what could be better than a bunch of fluffy ducks? I had my doubts. So we loaded out of that location and we broke for lunch, and it was there that we learned that the story of the rescue that we'd heard was bogus. The Foots had in fact been rescued by the Auto Club when their car had gotten stranded, but it was before the 0800 number had been set up, and they had called the Auto Club directly at their office rather than going through the special number. This threw the people from Telecom for a loop because they hadn't realized this, even though the 0800 emergency rescue number had just been set up 2 days before, and the Foots had been cast in the film several weeks before. So the head client was talking his way through this, and he said, well, of course we don't want to be dishonest. Okay. I'm thinking, this is a commercial. Are you kidding, buddy? Of course we don't want to be dishonest, but there really was no way they could use the 0800 emergency rescue number because it hadn't been set up yet. We all knew that, and they knew that. He said, but if the number had been set up in time, they would have and could have used it, and probably should have used it. And the other clients nodded sagely, as if this feeble rationalization was some kind of immutable wisdom. So that's how it happened, because we were setting up to film a reenactment of their rescue near Mrs. O'Brien's house, not near their home. And that's how it happened, that after filming Mr. and Mrs. Foot in artificial sunlight in somebody else's house, in front of somebody else's knickknacks, and somebody else's teapots, and pictures of somebody else's children and grandchildren, we filmed them being rescued by a wrecker they'd never seen, with a driver they'd never met, on a road they'd never traveled, to advertise an emergency number they'd never used. Then we drove back to Wellington, but at least we'd found Grandma's house. Mission accomplished. Yeah.